Welcome to the Pondering Education Podcast. Please be sure to visit us on social media on Twitter at Ponder Education and on Facebook at facebook.com/Pondering Education. Please be sure to subscribe to Pondering Education on your preferred podcast platform. For now, sit back, relax, and enjoy Pondering Education. Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to the Pondering Education Podcast. My name is Ryan McHale, and it is fantastic to be back. The show has taken a bit of a hiatus, and this is the first show in about 4 months, and we have a great one for you here tonight. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're all staying healthy, safe. I hope you're all happy. I know this is some tough times that we're in, but we will get through it, and I hope for all the best to all the students and teachers and faculty, all the families, all the stakeholders, and every school across the country, across the world. We will get through this, so best of luck to everybody as we prepare to start the 2020-2021 school year. On tonight's show, I will be joined by Boston City Council member Michelle Wu. We will have a great conversation related to the reopening of Boston Public Schools and so much more. So stick around. That's coming up in just a couple of minutes. But first, we do want to get to one of the first of 2 new segments on Pondering Education. We will be doing 2 new pieces here every week on the show. Number 1 will be the Education Book Recommendation of the Week. And then later on, to end the show, we will end with the educator to follow on social media. Basically, the main goal is to put out some amazing work by educators all over the world, and hopefully you can learn just as much from them as I continue to do. Some of my favorite educators and historians, folks that really are out there doing the work and need to have their work amplified, because what they're doing is certainly changing the landscape of education. So I want to start today with the Education Book Recommendation of the Week. And for this week, it is We Want to Do More Than Survive: Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom, written by Dr. Bettina L. Love. This book is absolutely phenomenal. I know a lot of folks out there are reading books such as White Fragility, now that we are in this movement of anti-racism, anti-bias, and that is a fantastic book, and a lot of those books are great, but they do act as sort of a whiteness 101, but it won't really get much change into the classroom per se as some other works. And I do want to highlight this one, We Want to Do More Than Survive. It really will get you thinking about our practices in the classroom and some changes that we can make in education to ensure justice and liberation for all students. So if you are out there thinking, what exactly is abolitionist teaching and what is this book all about? Please allow me to read just a little bit of an excerpt from the book, and this is what Dr. Love has to say. Abolitionist teaching is built on the creativity, imagination, boldness, ingenuity, and rebellious spirit and methods of abolitionists to demand and fight for an education system where all students are thriving, not simply surviving. I know as an educator that this task seems daunting and overwhelming and an already taxing mission, but courage and vision are required. Abolitionist teaching is choosing to engage in the struggle for educational justice, knowing that you have the ability and human right to refuse oppression and refuse to oppress others, mainly your students. What does this approach look like in the classroom and beyond? Teachers working with community groups in solidarity to address issues impacting their students and their students' communities. reimagining and rewriting curriculums with local and national activists to provide students with not only examples of resistance, but also strategies of resistance. Protecting and standing in solidarity with immigrant children and their families. Joining pro immigrant community organizations in the fight for rights for all, knowing that freedom is impossible without women and queer leaders being the thinkers and doers of abolitionist movements. Engaging in civics education that teaches direct action and civil disobedience while incorporating the techniques of the millennial freedom fighting generation, such as social media, impactful hashtags, and online petitions. Abolitionist teaching is refusing to take part in zero tolerance policies and the school to prison pipeline, demanding restorative justice in our schools as the only school wide or district wide approach to improving school culture. And that is just a sample of what you will read and learn from Dr. Bettina Love through We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching, and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom. That is our education book recommendation of the week, and you can find links to purchase this book right in the show notes. So, with that said, let's move on to our main event of the podcast this evening, my interview with Boston City Councilor Michelle Wu. All right, welcome back. I am honored to be joined now by Boston City Councilor Michelle Wu as we discuss the reopening of Boston Public Schools in this era of COVID. Thank you very much, Councilor Wu, for joining me today. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. Stressed about this situation, but generally healthy and happy that my family's all healthy. So best we
Oh,
can.
glad to hear that. I know that you yourself had actually tested positive for COVID antibodies. How was that going through that?
It was a shock. I mean, it was really eye-opening to see the process. Very quick, very efficient. No reason why we couldn't expand it broadly, make it really universally accessible. But also just a huge reminder that this is something we can't see, we might not know we ever had, and
Mm.
um, how much of it, how great the stakes are for what discussion we're having now about schools.
Right, and the time is ticking as we approach the beginning of the new school year here in the Northeast. A lot of schools are already in session across the country, but for those unfamiliar with the current reopening plans outlined by the Boston Public Schools, could you please take us through the city's current plan, as Mayor Marty Walsh calls it, a hopscotch model?
Right. So I think the best way is to start by taking one step back, which is to start at the state level, and to note that every district across the state has to submit three plans to the State Department of Education. One that's an entirely remote option, one with a hybrid, and which means some in person and some remote, and one that's an in person. And outlining kind of what combination of what would trigger you going into each of these types of plans is has been done as of today. Um, Now in Boston, the hybrid option that BPS is proposing is, as you said, called the hopscotch model. That means that um, we are, I like to think of it as simultaneous teaching, half and half model that is really difficult to imagine how it could serve anyone really well. Teachers would have to teach both in person and remote learning students at the same time because the students would be split into two groups. The first group would come into school on Mondays and Tuesdays. The second group would come in on Thursdays and Fridays. Buildings would be cleaned on Wednesdays, although teachers would still be there on Wednesdays as well. It's really difficult to see that being a workable option. You think about not only the educators' ability to manage that and how different remote and in-person teaching is, but for families who desperately need in-person learning, getting only 2 days a week still falls far short of what they need. So it's really unfortunate that that's the hybrid model that we're discussing.
Yeah, and are there specific reservations that you've brought up with the mayor's office and with the school committee and the leadership of Boston Public Schools? I know you had released some documentation last week. Can you just take us through some of your specific reservations about the current plan?
Yeah, so I had submitted a 9-page document to the school committee and the superintendent that was really reflecting back feedback from constituents and from school community members. We had had lots of small group discussions, a larger town hall type community conversation, and there's some pretty consistent themes. One was that I did not have a single person, a single constituent say, my preference is this hopscotch model. I think this would really serve my needs well. For educators, it feels very unworkable to do simultaneous teaching. For students and families, it feels risky in terms of the public health impacts. And again, only 2 days a week in and then 3 days out is not serving what anyone needs. There are a couple other points aside from even the particulars of the hopscotch. One is that the plan says throughout the document, the draft reopening plan says throughout the document that public health and science should lead the way in decision making. And yet, there's no information on how public health data might actually be incorporated or whether we're really following the best available guidance. There's no uh, universal COVID testing provided. It's not even required for anyone to have before coming into school. The first version of the plan had students and families responsible for bringing water because water fountains would not be accessible.
Mm,
There's a wide acknowledgement that only 32 school buildings have full HVAC systems and therefore the most updated air filtration. And yet we're going to rely on old buildings and old windows for the health and safety of everyone else. And lastly, there's no direction on how our processes have to change if the public health data changes, right? Say there is an
mm,
outbreak at a particular school, or say a student or an educator has been exposed to someone else outside school who has been infected with COVID. What happens then? There's really no guidance whatsoever in the document. So the most frustrating part is that really it feels like all these months later, we're still as uncertain about what will happen with school and how to keep everyone safe as we were when the district shut down back in March.
absolutely, and that's something that I think is really unnerving for teachers and students and their families and every community. Do you happen to know if uh, the city is looking at what's happening in schools across the country that have reopened and have since already been closing, and the rate of infection is increasing, especially among young children? Because when schools closed, um, we didn't really know much about how COVID would transfer with children because they were brought in and brought to their homes really prior to the peak in Boston.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, it's important to note one thing as well, which is that our school leaders are being left with pretty awful options at this point,
Hmm.
and largely because of decisions that were outside the control of the school
Yeah.
district, right? If we had prioritized back in March the idea that we need to be in a position creating conditions for schools to reopen safely in the fall, but come next school year, I think we would have handled our reopening processes across the economy very differently.
Hmm.
Not just nationally, but right here in Massachusetts. I think there's been a failure of leadership and government in parts outside the school systems to prioritize what school systems would need to guarantee the safety of everyone. We haven't had universal testing and contact tracing. We have moved through these phases and let the numbers go up. Um, we had a city council hearing on this topic a few days ago, and I noted then that the number of new cases the day of that hearing was actually higher statewide than the number of new cases when we shut down schools. So we're really back in a very precarious position. And it's not all because of, it's largely because of issues outside the kind of education sphere. However, it still doesn't mean that we should stick to the worst of the options because
Yeah.
we haven't, engaged community members enough to really incorporate all the creative ideas that are out there, and so really to tackle this as a crisis head on.
Yeah, and there seems to be, there's not a lot of consensus among anybody really about how to open schools. As you said, it's kind of like what's the best of the worst options at this point. One of the things that's always fascinated me about Boston is it's definitely has an unfortunate history uh, within the public school system, within the city, regarding segregation.
Hmm.
And when I think about one of the most talked about podcasts right now, that Nice White Parents, I don't know if you've
Yes, I have.
excellent and really eye-opening podcast.
Yeah, shout out to McCormick educator Nima Avashia who sent it to me. So I've
Oh,
been making
that's
my way through.
awesome.
Yeah.
And when I think about that podcast, I think about Boston's history. I think about even many surveys out there finding that families of color are really hesitant about reopening in-person schooling. Do you believe that there is a nice white parents kind of element to this push to hastily reopen schools, despite what experts might be saying?
Yeah, I mean, the data really bear out very deep differences in how families of color are feeling about in-person learning compared to white families. So we know from the parents who were surveyed, the families who responded to the BPS survey, that some 15-16% of the white families wanted fully remote learning, while way larger, double that amount in terms of the Latinx community and the Black community wanted to focus on remote learning. And then the numbers kind of flip in the other direction. I think some of this is really, it's a reflection of where the public health and economic impacts of this crisis have been, right?
Mhm.
Boston, for all that we think of ourselves as an extremely progressive, modern, sort of well resourced city, saw unconscionable divides in how this COVID pandemic has been experienced across communities, right? 40% of infections in the Black community, which more than double or about double their share of the population. And so we know that a lot of the devastation, the grief, loss of life, and health consequences have been squarely on the shoulders of Black and Brown communities in Boston. And of course, that will lead to a different understanding, a deeper understanding of what's at stake here. I
Yeah.
think there's this sense that, across the district, white families tend to be represent a higher percentage of students at schools that are more well resourced, right, with updated
Mhm.
ventilation systems in good conditions, where there's more space for everyone to space out. So, you know, I think we're seeing an element of that. It needs to be reflected in decision making because the superintendent and the city have always said that equity is going to lead our decisions. But
Yeah.
this is really bearing out here.
Yeah, and speaking of the equity issue, are you concerned at all about the rise in these pandemic pods that a lot of parents are forming, and how that might actually be expanding the opportunity gap and widening that gap for students of color, special education students, English language learners?
Yeah, I mean, no one should be told that they can't pour every bit of energy, resource, and passion that they have for taking care of their own kids into fixing this situation, right? So it makes total sense that
Mm,
those with resources are going to do what it takes to feel like they're caring for their own children, right? I'm a mom. I know I will do anything. I will bust through walls to make sure my
right.
kids are safe and healthy and all of that. Um, at the same time, it reflects such deep disparities that have existed way before COVID, reflecting generations of segregation and disinvestment into under-resourced communities that our schools really helped carry out as well. Um, we know from the data that we have around remote learning from last school year how wide of a gap there was in terms of who was accessing remote
Mm,
learning, how it was going, the work that was being the rigor and accessibility, but we will see the consequences, right? I always say that you can't delay on school decisions because every year that goes by is a new class of young people who is beyond our reach and our ability to support them. And so it's not just okay, well we'll take a couple years to figure this out, and sometimes
Yeah.
policy pushes take a while, but we're talking about the opportunities and the lives kind of grade by grade by grade missing out.
Yeah, and uh, yeah, as we talk about the inequities and we talk about the history and what this pandemic has kind of shown, uh, and given the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's latest review of Boston public schools back in March, prior to pandemic school closures, in which was demonstrated that there's a lot to fix within the Boston public school systems related to systemic racism and the inequity that students and families are experiencing. Do you see this moment as an opportunity to reimagine one of this country's oldest public school systems?
Mm.
And do you believe Boston public schools can go about finally attaining this racial and social justice that will ultimately and hopefully be effective, but also sustainable?
Yeah, I love that you brought up the history of our district because, we talk about it as the oldest, and this refers to many landmarks in Boston, right? But
Mhm.
another way to think of being the oldest is that we were the first. We were the first to recognize that it benefits everyone when our young people have free, high quality education. And it benefits everyone when there are libraries and parks open to everyone. So for our school district, it's really about living up to that legacy of how much we all benefit when we're investing in each one of our students and giving them everything they need to reach their full potential. So absolutely yes, we need to use this period to reimagine everything. And I think there's so many lessons learned in terms of the role that schools play in our family, in our economy, in our city, that it wasn't just about how do we get kids the learning that they need, but we were delivering meals to families who had relied on schools for that nutrition. We were thinking about ways to connect in technology and replace some of the mental health supports and address trauma that otherwise, was um, made better by adults at school and some of the resources there, although we are still falling very, very short. Um, this is all to say our schools are community hubs and they need to be treated that way, that we cannot operate just in the silo of Boston Public Schools alone, separate from the housing needs of our families and the nutritional needs and the recreational and health needs. Our schools can really be that hub to open up everything else that we have to offer. And I think it's really important to use this moment to seize on the historic activism in this modern day civil rights movement as well. That our schools must be anti-racist, right? Not, of course, a baseline of training for staff and curriculum, but demilitarization of our schools, right? Removing
Yes.
metal detectors and school police, tackling the school to prison pipeline, and we have a proposal on the table at the city council for restricting the ability for our current school public safety infrastructure to communicate with ICE and other agencies, and eliminating surveillance of undocumented students and their families at our schools. These communities need to be lifted up, and schools are really a microcosm of how we include everyone and give everyone what they need to be the best possible parts of our community that they could.
Yeah, and that's phenomenal. I certainly agree. You have openly also discussed being in favor of defunding police and reinvesting in our communities. Do you see such a redistribution of funds as one way of working towards achieving these goals of equity and anti-racism and anti-bias in public education?
So I think the connection between schools, public education, and public health and public safety is so clear, especially during this pandemic, right? The risks that families have been absorbing, the health harms, the exposure to the virus, everything is interconnected. And the way that we evaluate how efficiently we're using our resources, right? Taxpayer dollars that are supposed to serve the public good should be in the context of that entire ecosystem, right? How are our young people and their families doing when it comes to safety and health overall? And in that vein, it does make sense to look at putting our resources upstream, right? Supporting families before there is a need to think about addressing um, deviations from the law or thinking about how that is reflected in school discipline practices as well. Um, we need to completely reimagine how we are delivering services, and when we talk about structural change, that has to start with the structure of government itself, right? What are
Hmm.
we doing in each department? How are we resourcing every program relative to the impact it's actually having on our communities?
Yeah, and I think it's such an important discussion to have, and I'm really thankful that you and many other leaders in the city of Boston and across the state are engaging in such discussions. One of the things that I remember reading about last year was the criticism that came down upon some Boston public schools from the Boston Police Union, heavily criticizing schools for participating in Black Lives Matter at School movement. And as Boston Public Schools continues to kind of come to terms with its own past and present filled with systemic racism, are you in favor of Boston Public Schools continuing to actively participate in movements such as Black Lives Matter at school?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been so inspiring to see the power and the influence that our young people have when they are supported to use their voices and speak out. And we know in the history of our country that major steps forward in movements and equity and civil rights have always been with young people in the lead. So, you know, if we want to push our schools to be actively anti-racist, part of that baseline is continuing to declare unapologetically that Black lives matter. And so anti-racism needs to be the fabric of our schools, and that means empowering our students and our school communities to be part of that movement.
I couldn't help but feel for those educators and those students and those families at that time. I teach eighth grade English, and even reading The Hate You Give, which is a tremendous book by Angie Thomas, that highlights the Black Lives Matter movement. And I've felt the pushback from parents myself, and I know how hard that can be. And I just want to share how proud I am in the students and faculty at the
Mm-hmm,
schools for pushing forward and continuing to fight, as you said, unapologetically for this anti-racist movement.
mm-hmm.
Uh, Earlier in the days of this quarantine, uh, as a teacher myself, it was nice to kind of hear the praises that were coming out and understanding how tough the job can be as kids were at home and trying to learn remotely, and parents and guardians and caregivers really understanding the day-to-day inner workings of education. It was great to feel that sense of appreciation. But over the past few weeks, the general tone and rhetoric towards teachers has kind of drastically changed. Many want educators to, stop complaining about the dangers of returning to the classroom, saying that we're essential workers, taxpayers pay our salaries, we need to get into our office, as they call it. It certainly has left teachers feeling a bit overwhelmed and overcome with anxiety. Many are choosing to leave the field altogether. What message would you send to all the teachers that are listening out there today?
I hope they all know, first and foremost, that your concerns are valid and your fears are valid. And so I just want to emphasize that. Um, and secondly, I personally know how important the work is. Again, as a BPS mom, I'm so grateful for our educators and what they have done and will continue to do for our students. Um, and then from a policy perspective, we have to be absolutely clear that the safety of our teachers and our school staff and their families, right? Because our teachers are also parents and guardians and community members. Their safety is not secondary. It's not something that kind of comes after figuring out, everything else. So asking our school community members, our educators to sacrifice their own well-being or their family members, it doesn't end up serving our children either. I think that gets to a larger issue about how we tend to think about public schools, right?
Hmm.
So much of this tension has been because of this understated um, concept that the primary purpose of public schools is to, babysit kids or kind of keep them somewhere so parents can go to work. Right? Can you imagine some of the other private school districts or well-resourced districts saying that that was the primary purpose? Right? No, it's to make sure that there's the most supportive, nurturing, enriching environment possible for our young people to grow and to thrive. That's what we're creating. Is that we want them to be developing and learning and growing in schools. And if you remove that, if that question is, would sending students to school in an environment where we are sanitizing everything and you have masks on for hours at a time and you can't touch anyone, you can't be near your teacher or your friends, and your teacher's not looking at you all the time because they're also teaching a remote learning class simultaneously, that doesn't serve the that doesn't add up to the most nurturing and supportive and educational environment possible. I think the conversations should go very differently, again, involving factors outside of school. If the concern is that we need childcare, we need quality access to childcare, that is something that the state government, the governor, our state regulators, and city government outside of the school district should be addressing. Right? It's not the responsibility of school districts to take care of the entire range of families' needs during the workday.
Well, thank you once again, Counselor Wu. I know you're extremely busy, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I just want to give you just the final words. Anything you'd like to say to the students, families, teachers, all the stakeholders of Boston Public Schools as we prepare for the reopening of schools next month? I just want to give you the floor.
Well, first, thank you for having me and for convening this. I want to thank all your listeners as well for engaging in these very difficult conversations and making sure that we're creating lots of ways for voices to be heard and to get into more details about ideas than you can with 2-minute testimony at school committees and quick letters back and forth. I think what we need most of all right now is to empower our communities, our school communities, to be heard, to really think outside the box about what we needed to address far before COVID and how we can align all the resources that are going to be available to address this crisis in pushing us in that direction. That we're not going to settle for band-aids here and there, for getting by with something that feels the most defensible out of really awful situations. We really can do right by our students, families, and educators. But we need everyone's ideas, and we need to continue to push for that safe and equitable recovery together.
Well, fantastic. And thank you again so much, City Councilor Michelle Wu. Thank you again. Take care of yourself, take care of your family, and wishing you all the very best.
Thank you very much.
And I just want to give a sincere thank you once again for Counselor Michelle Wu for joining me on the program here this evening. If you are unfamiliar with the work of Michelle Wu, she has done a phenomenal job for the citizens of Boston. She was elected to Boston City Council in November of 2013 at the age of 28, becoming the first Asian American woman to serve on the council. Less than 3 years later, she was elected president of the Boston City Council in a unanimous vote, becoming the first woman of color to serve as council president. In my opinion, Councilor Wu is someone to keep an eye on for the future of Boston politics. I have a feeling she will be doing tremendous things for all citizens of Boston for many, many years to come. So thank you once again, City Councilor Michelle Wu. Now, I did say at the beginning of the show that there are two new segments. The first one is the education book recommendation of the week, and that was We Want to Do More Than Survive by Dr. Bettina Love. The second new part to the show is our educator to follow on social media. I just want to highlight some of the tremendous educators and researchers, historians, folks who are out on social media really putting out some tremendous information that we can all learn and grow from, and someone that I think we will all benefit from following on social media. So this week, I would like to highlight Dr. Dina Simmons. And I think a lot of you out there probably already know the work of Dr. Dina Simmons. She does a lot of anti-racism work, a lot of work with social emotional learning, and I just learn so much from her on a daily basis. And I put her Twitter link and links to her most recent articles right in the show notes, and I cannot tell you enough just how brilliant Dina Simmons is. And definitely, if you are not following her on social media, on Twitter, definitely look in the show notes, click the link, and give her a follow. You will learn just so much. She is doing phenomenal work, again, in the areas of social emotional learning, anti-racism, really talking about the dangers of whiteness in social emotional learning and things that we really do need to look out for as we begin implementing new protocols within our buildings. So please give Dina Simmons a follow and you will not regret it. We are just about out of time. That was a tremendous show. One of my most favorite episodes that we've ever done. And I am just so excited to get back. And I'm looking at doing a new show to be released each and every Sunday from here on out until we decide to take a little break again. So I hope you did enjoy the show. If you did, please like it, please share it. Please subscribe to it on your preferred podcast platform. Follow us on social media and stick around. We're going to learn a lot together. This is not a show about me. This is a show about us, and we're going to learn and grow from each other and make sure that our students are getting everything that they deserve and so much more. Thank you again for joining me, and have a great night and a great week. We'll see you next Sunday night on Pondering Education.